Hello, Colorado Realtors. I'm Scott Peterson, and thank you for joining me for another edition of Legal Bites. So in today's edition of Legal Bites, we're going to be talking about, it's kind of a follow-up, almost a part two to one of my last videos that I did, which was the when you can be a transaction broker. It was TB or not TB. That is the question. So this is kind of a follow-up to that. It's based on some feedback we've had from some of our more astute members related to kind of a subsidiary question on that. So in TB or not TB, we talked a little bit about when you can be, or situations where you can't be a TB because of your relationship with a client is such that you couldn't possibly not be their advocate or their fiduciary, so you have to be an agent. So this is kind of a subsidiary of brokerage relationships related to that, and it's related to change of status. All right, what, when, and why? So changing status is something that you guys often do when you're moving from an agent to a transaction broker in a relationship, and generally it's going to be with a seller. Sometimes it could be with a buyer if you go and find a FSBO, FSBO transaction where seller's unrepresented, but that's generally what's when a change of status occurs, is when you're a listing agent, you're going to change your status because there's an unrepresented buyer and you're going to come and act as a transaction broker in the situation. So first of all, the ability to change status is governed by your listing agreement. Either you're in both the exclusive right agreements, both listing agreement, buyer exclusive right and a seller exclusive right. It's in paragraph 4. And as all of you probably know, there's a little checkbox in there that effectively says if you're going to act as the seller's agent, and you could either check a box that says no matter what, really, including if you were to happen to bring a buyer or you were to happen to represent a buyer on an unrepresented seller, you're going to remain an agent for that party, regardless. You're not going to change your status. You don't have the authority or the right to change your status. The other box, which I think is probably more often checked, and I would almost hope is more often checked, is the second box that says unless there's a transaction where the broker is involved with both parties, and your client in that case, either the buyer or the seller, pursuant to paragraph 4 of the respective agreement, says, yeah, if the broker is bringing the other party to the transaction, then we're going to allow them to change their status from an agent to a transaction broker in order to essentially, in your case, double into the deal, but possibly there's some savings, cost savings for your clients that are related to that as well. So it's paragraph 4 of your listing agreement where this is going to start. This is also governed by Commission Rule E41, and E41 says in essence that anytime there's going to be a change of status in a relationship, that it's got to be done so in writing. So in the case that you're changing your status from an agent to a transaction broker, you've got a change of status form that's part of your form book. All of you ought to be using it, definitely should be using it if you're doing that. So if you're going to change from an agent to a transaction broker, it's going to be part of your form book, and you use the change of status form. And make darn sure you get that because you need to, that essentially puts the party that you're changing the status with on notice that you're no longer representing them in the capacity of agent. You're going to fall down to a transaction broker and represent them in that capacity, which is less of an obligation. You're eliminating the fiduciary duties that the listing agreement established pursuant to the agency relationship that you had. Those go away, and now you just have the uniform duties associated with transaction brokerage. But it also includes that you're no longer going to be advocating or representing necessarily their best interest in good faith, fidelity, loyalty, and all of the additional fiduciary obligations. You're no longer going to be offering those to your client. Your client obviously needs to know that status is changing, and so that's what that's for. If you're going to change status from a transaction broker to an agent, which is probably less common and would only, I would think, happen in the case that you started off without a writing, maybe as an example, with a buyer client, and so by default you're a transaction broker, and you find a deal and there's a listing agent representing the seller in that case, and you want to change your status with your own buyer, you're going to be signing then an exclusive right to buy listing agreement with the buyer. And so in that case, you can create that agency relationship and essentially change your status from the default of transaction broker into an agency relationship. So some confusion that I get on this, and it's not uncommon that, let's say you're representing a seller and you're a seller's agent, and you get a sign call, or an unrepresented buyer maybe comes into an open house, and so they don't have a broker, and they would like to move forward with the transaction. You don't need to change your status in that case. You have every right to remain your seller's agent and treat the buyer as a customer. Customer is not a relationship, it's a treatment, right? There's only two relationships, agency and transaction broker, but you can treat that buyer as a customer and you can remain your seller's agent. There's no mandate whatsoever that says you have to change status to a transaction broker if you're the only broker in the transaction. You can remain your seller's agent. No need to do a change of status in that case. It often happens, that often occurs, because that's sometimes what a buyer is more comfortable with. They don't want to be treated as a customer. They'd rather you drop off some of the duties to your seller and essentially act as a referee or facilitator in the transaction and not offer advocacy and some of those other things to your client. So that's often what happens, but it doesn't have to happen. But listen, make sure you're doing this if you are going to remain your seller's agent. You have to disclose in every way you can to that buyer, including a brokerage disclosure to buyer that says, I am the seller's agent, I'm remaining the seller's agent, and I'm going to treat you as a customer. You want to get their acknowledgement on that. You want to make very, very clear to the buyer that that's what's going on and that you don't owe them any duties as a customer, that you're your seller's agent. And so make sure you have that. That's a big red flag in a file, can get you in a lot of trouble if you've got a confused buyer that somehow later on files a complaint against a broker and says, gee, I didn't realize that, I thought they were my agent, when in fact you were your seller's agent. So you want to be able to pull that document out of your file to say, yes, I had this discussion with the unrepresented buyer. They knew that I was treating them as a customer. So really important piece there. But the bigger point is you don't have to change your status. You can remain your seller's agent. Another situation would be when you, and I talked about this in the last slide, when you don't have a written agreement with your buyer. So by default, without a written agreement, you are a transaction broker. If you're running around with a buyer and they haven't signed any exclusive right to buy agreement with you, then by default, you're a transaction broker. So another way you could change your status with them, as I alluded to, is to create an agency relationship, and you could do that by having them sign an exclusive agency agreement. If you had exclusive right agreement with a buyer and you had checked the transaction broker box, then you would amend that exclusive right to buy agreement to amend that and change your status from a transaction broker to an agent. But again, much less likely scenario. And if for some reason you're changing your status in that regard and you've got an unrepresented party on the other side, then be very, very cautious. Disclose. So hopefully that addresses some of the confusion that I find on change of status. As always, if you have questions, the legal hotline is available 9 to 12, 1 to 4, Monday through Friday. And if you have questions about how to change status or when you need to change status, we're always available to answer those questions. So thank you again for joining me for another edition of Legal Bites.